Today, I'm joined by Eugyppius. He is a very prolific, I don't know, I'm probably not pronouncing this right. You can correct me in a second, but he's a recently prolific, a recently kind of exploding poster on Twitter. His beat is the coronavirus and its discontents and what that implies for the way we view science, the way we view politics, and the way we view our elites. And he is one of my favorite recent posters. And I wanted to have him on to kind of dig a bit into his, into what makes him tick and what made him be attracted to this subject. So welcome Eugyppius. How do I pronounce this?
Eugyppius is also fine. Eugyppius would be sort of a more German pronunciation, but yeah, Eugyppius is fine. Americans say Eugyppius.
Okay, perfect. So, Eugyppius, what made you? What was kind of the first moment that you realized that coronavirus is going to be a thing? It is interesting, and what attracted you personally to uncover some more hidden elements to this unfolding catastrophe?
Yeah, so I was very much pro containment and convinced by lockdowns early on. So March, I was sick with corona personally very early. One of the very earliest clusters from Israel related to the infections from Austria. So I was very sick. I was lucky I did not end up in the news or anything. I was very sick early on. And so it influences your psychology about the disease, and you think you have some kind of privileged knowledge of it, of course, because you've experienced it personally at a time when very few people had. And so I was very pro containment in March and April, but I also did not really pay attention to the news or any information about it. I was very low information on the corona front early on, and then I sort of forgot about it through May, and it just occurred to me that in Germany they wouldn't let it go. Right, there weren't any cases anymore. Almost nobody was sick. June, July, and they kept the ball in the air with the constant testing and the constant articles, and it struck me that something was really wrong with this. And when infections began to start again in September and October, it became very obvious very soon that the containment measures weren't doing anything. They weren't behaving as advertised, and they weren't having obvious effects on infections. And so that's how I became interested in the pandemic. It seemed there were many angles to what was happening that weren't really discussed in mainstream media sources. And there was, at the same time, a lot of disease surveillance data was being released by our health bureaucracies, by the Robert Koch Institute and so forth, full of information that just every day undermined what you read in the Süddeutsche Zeitung, written in major papers and so forth. And I thought, it's very interesting. There's a lot of scope here to investigate this phenomenon as an ordinary person. And that's how I became interested.
Yeah. So, without revealing any information about your background, you do have kind of a career or an interest in a parallel discipline. I think you're very obviously as someone who's very stats oriented. You know your way around a data set. This stuff is not foreign to you. So, is this kind of the reason that you felt it was accessible to you to actually dig into the data and see what it actually or how you would interpret it?
Well, so it's probably best to say I'm kind of like an archaeologist in real life. So I'm an academic. So I do a little bit of data, but not very complicated. I'm not a mathematician or anything like that. But what really happens is it wasn't any expertise I had that I can bring to this. I was just enforced idleness. There was a period of after September, October. I'm employed by the government of Germany. I'm technically a bureaucrat. And we weren't allowed to go to the office or to work for months and months and months. And so there's oceans of time and enforced idleness, nothing to do. This is separate from the lockdowns. Not a lot of people know, but there are efforts within the bureaucracy here in Bavaria to keep bureaucrats out of the office because no one wants to work anymore, right? And so you weren't allowed to work, and that's my whole life, And so I had to sit at home all day, and I just started reading hundreds of articles. I read several virology textbooks, and to understand more about the virus. So the knowledge itself is not. One must understand this field isn't very complicated. In fact, there's to know a little bit of high school genetics maybe or something, stuff you learn in gymnasium, but it's not crazy, right? It's not crazy complicated. Most of the research happens at a very unsophisticated level, and so most people, reasonably intelligent people with limited background knowledge who read a textbook can find their way around the literature and form their own conclusions, So that's my own background. It's not deeply relevant.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that makes sense. I mean, a lot of people from kind of our corner of the internet were very early on COVID, and they were very right looking back on all of the stages that we went through. They're probably more right than many of the so-called experts. So I'm definitely not someone to to say that it's a problem that you're not coming from whatever background of expertise. Actually, it might just be an advantage because you can kind of look at it a bit more holistically and have a bit of detachment from I don't know, whatever status implications any finding would have on your personal career or you being also an anonymous account. So I think that's definitely a plus. So I guess at this point, you having dug into the data deeply, do you have a feeling about a plausible this explanation about the origins of this? Because there's all sorts of ideas about where this came from, and do you partial to any of the available explanations?
Of course, I think from the beginning I was fairly convinced it was, of course, a product of gain-of-function research undertaken at the Wuhan Institute of Virology in Wuhan and accidentally perhaps released. I was very reluctant to talk too much about this angle because I suspect that part of the elite panic behind containment and lockdowns is sort of an informal, unacknowledged knowledge that exists among intellectual elites, the intelligentsia, that this is a lab-enhanced virus, and that's part of why they reacted in the insane way that they did, which they would never have done if it were influenza or something like that, right? So that's a big part of it. And so I thought one shouldn't talk too much about the lab angle because it just feed this lockdown insanity. But much more information has come out. It's very clear that there's this whole pandemic industry that has grown up since the 1980s surrounding planning for pandemics and biowarfare and all of this stuff. And a big part of this research is this gain-of-function stuff that they're doing. A small group of researchers, not very many, are doing. And it's clearly where the virus came from. It's fairly obvious the virus was developed by gain-of-function virologists connected with the EcoHealth Alliance and the Wuhan Institute, and then probably accidentally released. So, the only good precedent we have is the anthrax attacks in 2001 for a similar event, and that was intentional sabotage, and I'm fairly convinced that that's what happened there. So one shouldn't rule out sabotage in this case. It could have been released on purpose by a disgruntled researcher or someone to discredit the how do you say this line of research, right? So that's also possible.
Mm-hmm. So at this point, the idea that it jumped from a zoonotic version of the virus is not plausible anymore.
I don't think this was ever very plausible because it's of the foreign cleavage sites. So the spike protein of the virus is optimized to infect human cells, and bats, it's the closest relatives of bats. This ultimately originated in bats, but bats don't. Cellular anatomy is such that they don't take advantage of foreign cleavage sites. So the virus is obviously optimized to infect animals that aren't bats, and we are the primary candidate, right? It's got to be us. So it's clear that it's fairly obvious the virus has features that suggest it's been adjusted in a laboratory, right?
Mm-hmm. I think that's definitely a conspiratorial. It used to be a conspiratorial idea, and now it is. I think it's starting to be quite the mainstream. I think what was it in the was in the New York Times, so I guess it's been blessed by the powers that be.
Yes, also Nicholas Wade was for a long time the New York Times science reporter, I believe, and he had a long Medium essay where he laid out everything that people had said over months for why this probably came from a laboratory, and that seems to have sort of broken what was an uneasy attempt to portray the virus as a natural phenomenon. And since then, it's sort of quietly acknowledged everywhere that this is a lab-enhanced virus. What's very interesting is that has had no political fallout, right? Nothing has changed. Our approach to the virologists responsible for this hasn't changed. They're still regarded as authorities. It's very curious, and there's been no indictments, no grand juries, nothing, no attempts to investigate. I think it's very interesting.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That was my next question about this. If it is a lab leak, like what should the fallout be? I mean, I think this is kind of a permanent feature in a way of our expert class. You have catastrophe upon catastrophe, but the fact that it's all kind of diffuse. Responsibility is very diffuse in this kind of managerial superstructure that leads us. There is no reckoning. There is no mechanism to not even like depose these people. Like, I mean, even Fauci has now what is it, like icons? People kiss his image. They kneel, in front of the great man. And I think this is probably his second, incredible catastrophe after the AIDS crisis. So there is no reckoning, is there, for these people?
It's very interesting. There was obviously an early attempt, I think, to hurt Fauci or to take him down. Right, his emails were released, and of course, those Freedom of Information Act requests can be denied or delayed indefinitely. So clearly, somebody decided that they needed to hurt him a little bit. They were released with key passages redacted. So one imagines that there are within the bureaucracy in America, there are people who could potentially leak redacted passages in the emails that are already out there. So there's probably an effort to control Fauci. I would guess, maybe the political side or other agencies, to just rein him in. There's a similar thing happened with what was his name, Hancock, the UK health minister, who was obviously filmed by. He's filmed in his office having an affair with his secretary or somebody, right? And that was obviously an intelligence agency operation, and it was used to force him out of office. And then the UK changed direction on containment directly after. There are efforts to put pressure on these specific health ministers in Corona, SARS, or whoever, to rein and control them. And it shows that it can be done, but it's being done by shadowy forces inside the bureaucracies that aren't really interested in ending containment entirely. They don't really want out. They just don't want too much power to wander into these as public health bureaucratic sector, right? But yeah, there won't be. I don't think there can be indictments or any serious backlash against the researchers who did this. I think my theory of the elites in general is that they form this sort of cohesive consensus, and there's very little accountability or attempts to exclude people inside, and that this discipline that they have makes them powerful, right? But it also demobilizes them and makes it hard for them to act strategically. So no one can sort of excommunicate elite actors or punish them for misdeeds, but at the same time, there's widespread consensus always on policies, so they are able to act.
Yeah, that's it's kind of the it's elite theory, and it's also kind of like a class stratus thing, and it also just completely implodes the concept of any sort of democratic accountability. Not that anyone would still consider that any reality. People listening to this podcast that has anything to do with the reality. I think this is becoming clearer and clearer to more and more people. Or at least I am hoping that it is becoming clearer and clearer, because there is obviously no mechanism within any global system or local system to to bring these people to account, and also the idea that it's been it's going to be almost 2 years very soon since this thing started, and we started with 2 weeks to save the NHS, flatten the curve, whatever, medium posts and people getting scared, and we've essentially turned many states of the world into de facto police states. Even here, like now there's a mandate to wear masks on the street. There are curfews in action, for the vaccinated, unvaccinated alike. It's insane. Our whole lives have been turned into just one long TSA line. It's airport security 24/7 all the time. So I don't know what has this kind of shaken your I don't know, your idea of what politics can do for the common man, or has this changed your perspective on what is possible politically, or were you very blasé to begin with, or you weren't shocked by this?
No secret of it. I'm very profoundly anti-liberal and anti-democratic. I've always been very pessimistic about European democracy. I think it's a huge mistake. And of course, the globalizing institutions and the attempt to take power and put it in inscrutable bureaucratic systems has been the worst developments for Western civilization in our entire history. So I was already very, very pessimistic about the prospects for reasonable policy or anything from our current political systems. But what I never really imagined that such draconian, insane policies would be implemented in the way that they have. Changed my thought. What changed in my ideology? I always thought that Western democracies, they only want everyone to eat too much food and watch too much television and get too much fat. It's always just about this excess abundance and trying to placate the population with amusements and alcohol and drugs, right? And I never imagined that they would become so, I guess, authoritarian is the wrong word. They always were authoritarian. They would become so heavy-handed in repression. I always thought we were at least protected in the level of our everyday existence, that states wouldn't really bother to repress their populations because it's counterproductive and it destabilizes them ultimately. And I think this shows how they are much crazier than any of us thought. They're really, really insane. A lot of the people who run our governments are completely out of their minds. And I never imagined that this would happen. I thought that was going to be mismanaged in some way, it would have been in the other direction, right? I think we all thought that. I did anyway, January, February 2020. If anything, they would do nothing at all, right? They wouldn't even develop vaccines or something. And it could be very serious. It could have been SARS-1 all over again, So if anything, I thought they would fail that way. And the fact that they have failed this way is disturbing and dangerous. That shows, I think, they are really, really insane. A lot of these people are just out of their minds.
Yeah. So is this your theory that they're just completely out of their minds? Was there kind of a variant of reality where they would have failed in a different direction? Because to me, it felt that, China, put out those videos of people collapsing in the street and, hazmat suits and just complete lockdown. They had the first idea of, total lockdown. Then WHO jumped on the lockdown wagon. And it felt to me like that was the first domino. And essentially, any state that wouldn't lock down would have to justify why it wouldn't lock down, because obviously China, this is how they, they contain the most deadly virus in the universe. So it felt to me like, okay, if you're a world leader or a national leader, you kind of, your job was to lock down or else, and then that spiraled out of control, and here we are 2 years later, just still, justifying that first mover thing.
Of course, I only describe my perspective at the time. I've learned a lot in the last 20 months or so. I would never want governments to manage a pandemic ever again. I want them to do nothing. I've also learned, I think, that there isn't any other path. They're either going to do this and go crazy, or they're going to do nothing. There's no middle path, and I think there are a lot of reasons for this. sort of office politics is a bad one, but leftism it sort of works in this way where once an institution has been invested by leftists, there's always the right position, the correct position is always the most extreme one. And anyone who isn't at the most extreme will be outflanked by more extreme inferiors who will depose them and assume leadership. So once these leftist orientations are set up, you have policies which are constructed such that the correct position is always at an extreme end. So this is just how leftism organizes itself. So once you have leftist institutions, you can't have moderation anymore. You have just balls to the wall insanity, containment, or you have nothing. And so we learned a lot. Of course, I oppose pandemic management entirely now. But at the time, of course, I think a lot of the dissident right in February 2020 thought governments would do the opposite. They wouldn't close borders, that they wouldn't try to protect their populations from the dangerous virus. And a lot of people on the right were worried about that, right? And I guess I was a part of that as well, though. Again, I've learned in the meantime to be much more cautious about what you want your governments to do, because they have this debilitating sort of cultural cancer, and they can't behave rationally and with moderation, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And like you said, there is kind of this ratcheting into the direction of the right side of history. And the right side of history is always seems to be always more safety, more protection, zero COVID, zero deaths. You don't want to be the person left standing when the round of musical chairs is over and you're the person who's like responsible for one death, or for death in general, like as a philosophical concept. So it seems to me that there is no way to walk back a lot of this stuff. That's the scary part to me. Actually, like I think it was like at the beginning of the year or last year, I wrote like this, lockdown is forever, and I still believe that. I think once you take a measure like lockdown out of the box and you create the not only kind of the philosophical structure where people accept it, and they accept it once, accept it twice, that's already part of the toolbox. There's no way to, and then people were telling me, oh, no, they stopped locking down in the particular place where I was. Well, since then they've locked down maybe 5 more times in that particular place and everywhere else, because this is now on the menu. Lockdowns are on the menu, masks are on the menu, masks for children, masks for toddlers are on the menu. So any sort of ultra invasive, paranoid, safetyist, hysterical measure is now on the menu, and people seem to like it, which is kind of this in a way the scariest part. You'd think that people would revolt. Like, why do you think that there's so much acceptance for this stuff?
It's I think a big part of it is well, first I would say the never mind. A big part of it is people have been isolated for a long time at home and out of the ordinary social environments. Even now that here in Bavaria and Munich, it's a little bit more open, but I still don't see friends from abroad anymore. All my American friends, I never see them anymore, and I used to have friends from Czechia and Sweden visit, and it was always you always see people from abroad, and you're part of a broader social world, and it's grounding, and you form broader opinions in this way, and everyone's isolated now, much more isolated than they ever were. Most of my interactions now happen through a computer, and I think it's had very interesting cultural effects, and it's made people very extreme in some of their views. So I think a friend was telling me he thinks a lot of the journalism around Corona is so insane because journalists are the one class that have literally never been back to an office since April 2020. They have been at home this whole time by themselves, calling people, doing interviews, whatever, sort of insane internal domestic world where they're afraid to go outside and afraid of the virus. So people don't have any real concrete experience with what Corona is and with the virus itself, because our governments have tried to remove direct experience of reality. right? And they substitute scary headlines and disease statistics instead, and that becomes everyone's reality. You can't talk to your friends as easily as before at the pub or at the beer garden or something and learn what other people think and learn about, your friend whose aunt got sick but she's fine. You can't do that anymore. And it's all mediated by media now, and it's all filtered through various social media platforms, and that's had a very radicalizing effect. And I think the next thing is that no one knows how to turn this off. I think a lot of governments really do want to end it now, at least at some level. Maybe no one cares. Maybe administrators I know don't care about masks. They're happy to make us wear masks until we all die, but they don't want to lock down anymore. They don't want a lot of the heavier restrictions that is destroying our cities. It's very bad. Home office mandates, nobody goes to work anymore, and the center of European cities will die. All the restaurants, all the shops. The reason they exist is because everyone works in the center of Munich, right? You close all the offices, everyone works from home, that all goes away. No one wants that to happen, but no one knows how to turn this around. And people have just gotten crazy. And there's no, without encouraging people to mix socially and engage in ordinary, instinctive human behavior, to ground themselves and develop direct experience of reality, there's no way out. No one knows how to turn this off. So I don't know how to fix it. It's a very complex problem.
Yeah, and I feel like you say, the cat's out of the bag with a lot of this stuff. We are permanently changed. There are children who've been born under this regime. My baby's been born under this regime. I mean, who knows how long this is gonna last. And there are, also like young people whose like core formative years have been these 2 years where they should have been out and socializing and doing things with yeah, just being normal. Just I don't even know if the concept of normal was still recognizable to some people, like even to me. I mean, I've obviously been highly online in the last year or so, at least. And it's been good in many ways. Obviously, this podcast is an offshoot of that. But I am forever changed. I am, socially much more inept than I used to be. I used to be very outgoing and kind of like a social butterfly, but I am, maybe like one step away from full blown out autism by now. So, yeah, it's crazy, and I can't even imagine for people who already had social anxiety or problems to interact with people, which is probably a lot of people nowadays with the internet already. I can't even imagine what it does. I mean, the fallout from this will be so complex and so weird in so many ways. I don't think we can even model that. I mean, I don't know. Has your life changed significantly? I mean, you said your friends are not around. You're not really seeing anyone as much. But how else has your existence changed since this has happened?
There's a lot of interesting thoughts about this. Just to start, I noticed that people, the way they behave in public is now much more obtuse. They're always in the way. They walk much more slowly. They're not aware of people around them anymore. That's these stupid rules about 1.5 meters apart all the time. But people just are in their heads. They're not paying attention to others around them like they were before. And it's very striking how it's just been frustrating to interact in the real world now, because people are always in the way. They're always riding their bicycle the wrong direction. It's very interesting. It's created a lot of sort of interpersonal chaos and made getting back to real life and trying to go to parties and get outside worse. It's made it's not as fun as it used to be. Personally, I of course I'm a runner. I talk about this all the time. And when the pandemic first hit and the lockdowns first occurred, I thought this would be great. I would just run a lot more. I have plenty of time to train. Not allowed to work, so I could maybe run 180 kilometers a week, twice a day. But really, really train hard, and I haven't run anymore. You know, it turns out that a lot of athleticism and the stuff that I did was dependent on social interaction. It's about, you train for a race, you run with your friends, and it's not fun to train by yourself when there's no races to train for. And so, now I gain weight. I don't run as much. I don't lift nearly as often. I feel cognitively impacted also by the isolation. There's a certain amount of social interaction you need to think I'm a crazy internet artist. I don't like other people very much, and I'm reclusive, But, I was never reclusive as much as I have been this past year and a half, and I realize that the lack of social interaction is ultimately a sort of it's bad for clear thinking, and it's hard to think straight about problems because I don't know, it's stabilizing in some way. It's just an important part of being human. We are social creatures, and there are very strange effects, psychological effects that occur when you are in prolonged states of minimal social interaction, which is another thing I noticed about myself. And I ask other people, and they say similar things. Vivid dreams are another thing that has been happening to me for the last 18 months or so, where you have very vivid dreams, very strange dreams that I never really dreamed. I didn't care about my dreams much before, but I think it's another feature of social isolation and prolonged solitude, which is what has occurred. What's very interesting to me is the year and a half of home office we have had, that will never be reversed. I already see one of the reasons in here in Bavaria anyway, where I have some insight into the regional, the state bureaucracy and how planning occurs, is a lot of the internal pressure for lockdowns was driven by bureaucrats who never want to work anymore, and they never want to go back to work, and so all the home office rules that apply to me and others have all been formalized now. And so one of the reasons they don't want to lock down so much anymore is everyone has to go to the office anymore. So it's fine, right? That we can go back to the restaurants and open everything up. The bureaucrats don't have to go to work. That could last generations. And what does it mean when the state employs literally thousands, of these bureaucrats who make enormous amounts of money and who have, I guess, Americans, it would be the equivalent of tenured professors. They can never be fired. When they retire, they still receive full salary until they die. Enormously expensive bureaucrats who just don't do work anymore, right? They're just gone. And whatever they did before, I guess it was never necessary and nobody cares. I have no idea. And these people will never work again. And their higher successors probably won't work either. And the state will just support these people for indefinitely 30, 60 years. I don't know how long it lasts. This is really crazy to me. I don't know what the long-term effects will be, but it's devastating. And again, I guess I would only say there's no way to turn this off. No one knows how to stop any of it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. And like you said, there's so much there's just so much slack in the system. I feel like, Europe and the US have been living off, the fat of the land for a long time. For, it's just an unsustainable um level of civilizational consuming. There's a lot of, there's just not enough slack in the system to make this last forever. You see this in, supply chain issues. You see this in just, like we said, every level of, managerial bureaucratic incompetence. The fact that, barely anyone knows how to build a bridge anymore. This is essentially, the kind of the opening credits of idiocracy that we're sliding into from so many levels. So I don't know. Do you think that there is still enough slack in the system to keep feeding, bureaucrats like these for another 50, 60 years? Or are things going to come to a more abrupt conclusion sooner than that?
It's a very good question. I don't know. It's very hard to say. I always am more pessimistic and think they will hit a wall sooner, and I'm always wrong. So I guess I would try to err on the side of saying they can maintain this for a long time, probably. I don't have direct insight into all of the processes that underlie this, all of the limitations that there are or that possibly exist. The, I would tend to say that they could probably continue this for a long time. They certainly don't act like they're running out of anything. Against any kind of hard limits. It's exactly the opposite. They behave like this is completely sustainable and this can be done forever. course, maybe it's just that it's in no one's interest to worry about the distant future. And another one of my themes is that there is no long-term planning, right? There's no longer-term planning beyond 8 or 9 months. I think if you understand everyone's planning within about an 8-month window, a lot of government actions become clear. So maybe it is just they have no idea what to do beyond the next 8 months, and so as long as they can pay each other, it's okay. But I receive a pay raise. I have hardly been to work. There are really strange problems, especially with supply chain issues you mentioned. So, from my work, I use some machines. They're not crazy complicated or anything. They're like fancy photographic equipment, right? And one of them, it doesn't work anymore, and it's broken in some way, and no one can fix it. It's literally just permanently broken. You can't buy a new one. And there's some kind of supply chain issue, and we just don't have this thing anymore. And that's never happened in my life. That you just don't have access to this important machine, which would have been changed out in a day. 2 years ago, these are very disturbing, strange things. And what's weird is how everyone reacts to it. Everyone's just fine with this, and it's very strange to me. It's that everyone's like, "Oh yes, that machine, it's broken. We can't do the photographs anymore." And no one questions this or asks about how strange everything has suddenly gotten. It feels like we are just in a totally different world.
Yeah, exactly. It does kind of it feels like, the fact that we've been online for so long and away from each other has kind of trained us for the world that is coming. And then you kind of have the reality where, meat space or, IRL is becoming just this completely distorted place. But then you're trained for the internet anyways, so you don't really notice, or you're already kind of like a bit out of it, I mean, I feel like people are a bit sleepwalking. They don't relate to reality anymore because it is foreign to them now. It's just not the same place. So, why, no one's really invested in reality anymore. So maybe that's why they're just, they're kind of washing their hands of whatever happens. And you can see this in inflation and the coming stagflation apparently that we're going to see. So I don't know. It's the markets haven't felt it yet, but it does feel to me like something's coming. Like you see these little signs. The fact that your machine's not being replaced, the fact that people are getting paid without doing anything. Remote work for a lot of employees, either in the private or public sector, just means sitting at home and just watching stuff on the internet, scrolling TikTok. There's a lot of value that's not being, harvested into the real world. So, I guess, yeah. The question is again, how much slack is there in the system? How much can any of this take? Yeah, it's very dystopian. It's kind of disturbing to me, and it could collapse at any time, which is also kind of the weird part.
Yeah, no, there's I yeah, I never quite know how unstable it is. It the on the one hand, I've just never seen such levels of insane behavior as I have over the last 2 years or so, where all of the all of the corona policies are enforced with this insane eagerness and energy, with no view to their true cost or to how we might stop doing these policies. As you said, once you opt into things like lockdowns, you can't so easily opt out. And already we have editorials in major newspapers talking about how we might lock down for the influenza in the future, and of course this was predictable and a terrible idea to lock down in the first place because you can't ever stop doing this. An important consideration, I guess, is for me how long major cities and economic centers in Europe can be maintained if no one's at work anymore. I think a big part of the European culture is centered on major cities, and that's also part of our I don't know, our society and our productivity as well. And it's already starting to dissolve. And I think perhaps there will just be a cultural dissolution in advance of an economic one, where people move out to the countryside, and where a lot of sort of what happened in the U.S. since civil rights, of course, where a lot of cities are sort of hollowed out, and that has if you look at America, it has had very persistent cultural effects, and it's I think a lot of I don't want to offend American friends, but there's sort of a problem with degraded American culture. I think everyone sort of understands there's something wrong with sort of at least American culture as it's exported and experienced abroad. And I lived in America for many years. It's not an insult to anyone there. There's something happens when you wipe out your cities and displace them, and there's this massive generations-long cultural degradation that occurs, and it feels like we may be doing something very similar right now.
You also talk a lot about the vaccines lately because this is kind of the thing that is now on the top level of coronavirus policy. So, I mean, does the vaccine save lives? Kind of what is your take on it? You've been quite critical of it, but I wonder what is wrong with the vaccine, because essentially it's been billed as the thing that is going to release us from whatever we're in at the moment.
Yes. So at the start, of course, I was very pro vaccine. I thought the vaccine would at least end the rationale for lockdowns, and it would get us out of this mess. Everything could be resolved with vaccination. It just hasn't worked. It just obviously hasn't worked, and so the vaccine has twofold effect, roughly speaking, and setting aside the fact that it has a very bad side effect profile. There's something wrong with it. It hurts people. Vaccine injuries are a real thing. There's a lot of data, not good data, but we have many indications that it's dangerous to certain people, young men, and that it's overall much more dangerous than ordinary vaccines. So but setting that aside, it has two effects. It makes corona less severe in the vaccinated. So if you're vaccinated, you will have a lowered likelihood of severe illness, but not as much as a lot of media sources portray. So some of the best data from England, for example, it sort of just reduces your risk by about 20 or 30 years. So if you're 85, actually it's worse, it gives you the same mortality risk as a 75-year-old who's unvaccinated. Right? That matters because high age brackets are where most of the mortality happens. So there is an effect that is protective, but it's not hugely protective. It's much worse than all the vaccines we know. The other thing the vaccine seems to do, even if we don't understand all the ways it does this, is it seems to increase transmission. And it doesn't just increase transmission because we have ended lockdowns or something. Those policies never did a lot to contain corona. It increases transmission because of some other effect, a combination of effects. And so most of what I post about the vaccines is trying to understand how they increase transmission. That's the most important question. If we can figure out how they increase transmission, maybe we can mitigate some of that increased transmission. But the overall effect of the vaccines it does protect somewhat from severe outcomes, and it increases transmission. On the other hand, these wash each other out, and you're in the same world as you were before, more or less, it seems. So everywhere that is heavily vaccinated right now has pretty much the same or slightly worse statistics as they had before anyone was vaccinated. Places that are less vaccinated have it's sort of a mixed bag, but they're sort of Bulgaria, sort of in the Balkans. Where you are, Romania, things are much worse where you have very low vaccine uptake, and they're much worse than before. So it seems that maybe what happens with the vaccines is they make corona more virulent overall. And so for vaccinated populations, they just retain the level of corona risk they always had, but unvaccinated populations then get punished for not taking up the vaccines. And we see similar effects in animal vaccinations. The classic cases, Merck's disease in chickens, where chickens are vaccinated since since 1970s against this herpes virus, right? And basically you have very similar chicken mortality though as when they started vaccinating against Marek's disease, against this herpes virus, because it just got more virulent. And so it seems that viruses have an optimal level of virulence in the population where they don't take too many people out of circulation, but they still spread. And if you use vaccines that don't kill the virus outright, that vaccines that don't stop the virus, but merely slow it down, the virus just evolves to become more virulent in response to the vaccines, and you end up with the same situation. So I think this is the main effect we're seeing. There's probably other ancillary effects. And so the vaccines overall have just been not helpful. They haven't stopped corona, and they won't ever stop it. It's obvious that they're not effective.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a kind of theory of what the mechanism would be where, you know, the vaccines would be pushing kind of this evolution in the virus? Because I guess most viruses typically in the wild, they do tend to evolve towards greater virulence, but maybe less, you know, killing potential, just because their idea is to spread as much as they can and to, you know, propagate. So I wonder, why would the vaccine be the mechanism that, you know, pushes them into a more you know, drives their evolution into a different direction? How does that work?
So with chickens, we understand the mechanism very well. There are Marek's disease, this herpes virus, has many different strains, and there are mild strains that don't do very much, and there are very dangerous strains that kill all the chickens within a few days, and the chickens are infected right after hatching. The the mild strains are advantaged because the chickens have to survive to spread them, right? And so the before vaccination, you had mainly mild Marek's disease because the chickens had to survive to spread the virus. When you start vaccinating the chickens, the milder strains are outcompeted by the more virulent ones because the vaccinated chickens spread more, and the less virulent strains are outcompeted because they just don't produce as much virus, they don't spread as much as the more virulent strains. So the vaccinated, when you vaccinate all the chickens, the more virulent strains are then advantaged because they spread more, right? So there's not, I guess an important point is that the damage viruses do is directly related to their rate of replication, to sort of load of virus you have in you. So the viruses have to balance how much they replicate, how much virus you shed, with how you tolerate the virus, right? So there's always this balance between how much spreading the virus can do, how much it infects your cells, and how many copies of itself it makes that makes you sicker, of course, and how much spreading it can do. So a virus that is too eager to replicate will make you too sick. You'll die, or in our case, you'll stay home, right? And you won't spread the virus. The virus that is not aggressive enough won't get anywhere. It won't be spread. So there's sort of an optimal level of replication, and viruses tune themselves via. So the coronavirus, the SARS-2 virus, tunes itself via various mutations in the spike protein to achieve optimal levels of replication and ability to enter cells. So it replicates at the right rate for population, so it doesn't make people too sick and it can still spread. So vaccines upset this balance, right? They make it so that the virus has a lot of room to expand upwards in virulence without being punished for killing its hosts, or in our case, making you stay home. This seems to be a big aspect of how vaccines drive virus evolution. Vaccines when they don't stop infection.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I think I understand now. So the people who would essentially pretty much die from the variants that were quite aggressive, they don't. They just have a mild version. So the more aggressive variants, like you said, that punish the unvaxxed, get to kind of escape and you know, ravage through the population. But I guess if everyone, I mean, this is me, you know, being contrarian here. If everyone was vaxxed, would that dampen the effect even of the more aggressive versions that are created now through this kind of leaky vaccine?
Well, of course. So there's two ways the virus escapes. There's a few ways, but just to simplify, there's two ways the virus escapes the vaccine. It escapes via mutations that escape antigens, right? So your body recognizes certain proteins in the virus. The virus can mutate away from that recognition, and it can escape what your immune system recognizes, and so it evades your antibodies and your T cells and your immune response. So it can sort of mutate away from your immunity, and that's antigenic drift. But another thing the virus can do to escape immunity is to replicate faster, sooner. So to get sort of head start on your immune system, it takes a little while for your body to respond, to send its T cells, and to start producing antibodies against an infection. If the virus replicates very fast, very early, it can infect you before you can respond. So the vaccines do both of these things. They cause the virus to drift antigenically away from your immunity, and they also encourage strains that are more aggressive earlier, so they can get a hold in your lungs and infect you. So that aside, yes, of course, if we vaccinate everyone, then we have created a world where we have probably just returned to our prior corona risk, right? And we haven't increased it any. But we'll never have 100% uptake is the thing, right? We don't, we're not, as much as some of our politicians want to be, we're not China, and we can't force universal vaccination, so it's not really going to happen. There's always going to be probably at least 10 to 15% of everyone in all of our countries who aren't vaccinated, and children aside, of course. And so we always have to remember that there's never going to be universal vaccine uptake. And public health was about everyone's health outcome. Whether you choose to be vaccinated or not, the interventions have to help everyone. So of course it matters that the unvaccinated are hurt by this. But another point is that we will become dependent on the vaccines in the long term. So we could reach a point where we have to vaccinate all children and everyone all the time because we have encouraged the evolution of truly dangerous SARS-2 strains, right? There is no way out, and so we just have to vaccinate all the time, just like the chickens. If we start vaccinating chickens against Merck disease, we would have very few chickens. Maybe a few would survive with some sort of innate immunity or adaptations, and they would be sick. But that's unthinkable for humans. Our culture does not permit us to do this. So we would have to universally vaccinate forever. And so this is kind of a doom scenario. It's a little bit sci-fi, and one shouldn't exaggerate this either. So it took 20 years maybe of universal chicken vaccination to make herpes virus, Merck's disease in chickens into a very apocalypse scenario disease. It didn't happen right away. We're at the beginning of this process, I think, here with corona, but it will progress and it will get worse. And right now, it's only a little bit worse. One shouldn't exaggerate it a lot. The Delta strains aren't clearly more pathogenic. They are more transmissible, but not, crazy people on the internet, these hysterics. They're like, oh, it has a reproduction number of 12 or something. It's retarded idiots. It's not true. It's maybe 10% more transmissible than Alpha was at its low point. So the other thing that happens is the strains, of course, they get worse over time because they accumulate mutations and they don't spread as well, right? So one shouldn't exaggerate. We haven't created the apocalypse yet, but it's conceivable if we can't stop this in the next decade or 15 years, that we could have created a world where the virus has become quite dangerous. But I think there's a long time between now and then, and there's a lot of hope that this will eventually stop.
Mm-hmm. And this, the case that you present, the Merck virus, that's an HPV virus, and is the vaccine used in that case? Is it simply a leaky vaccine, or is it an mRNA vaccine, or is that where the kind of the similarity comes in?
They're leaky vaccines. They never, as far as I know, have developed mRNA vaccines for the chickens. They do use some vector vaccines, which would be like Johnson and Johnson or Sputnik or something, but they don't use mRNA for animals. That's a very new technology. But the similarity is that they don't really prevent infection. They just slow the virus down a little bit. So what you're doing when you slow the virus down is it's almost the inverse of a vaccine. You allow the virus to learn how to beat your immunity. You're sort of vaccinating the virus, if that makes sense, right? So you just disadvantage the virus enough. It can still replicate. It can still kind of learn how to beat this, and it's very leaky vaccines. They seem to kind of function as sort of vaccinations for the virus and less vaccinations for us. And similar treatments, also monoclonal antibody treatments and so forth. There are a lot of theories. These also train the virus in how to escape immunity, how to escape human immunity. They allow the virus to develop multiple strains in the same host that can recombine and experiment with different gene combinations to see what is most effective in escaping our antibody response.
Yeah, that's kind of the a very very disconcerting version of events. I mean, now I'm now thinking about it. I'm One of the things that comes up a lot, and which a previous guest on the show, the show hasn't aired yet. Richard Hanania, he was on the show, and I know you've had some harsh words about something he posted recently. He's very much on the vaccine bandwagon. I think his argument is that at the moment in many regions he sees that death rates are high, very high, almost exclusively in the population of the unvaxxed. I'm curious how you interpret that, the fact that it is true here in Romania as well. Most people who die of coronavirus at the moment are unvaxxed. This statistic taken on its own sounds damning, and I can see why Richard would view it that way. But I'm curious what your interpretation of this is, because this is on its face. It's like it's a serious indictment of remaining unvaxxed.
There's no question, as far as I can tell, unless statistics are pervasively falsified, and I don't believe that they are. I believe that the means to do that exists. That the unvaccinated die at high rates and are hospitalized at high rates. They're probably increasingly, maybe 8 or 9 months out, they're infected at lower rates, but they die at high rates. So that's probably the world we're all headed to. That's where England is now. Is probably a result of multiple factors, the virus specializing on vaccinated populations. So the unvaccinated, it's worse for them if they're infected, but it's worse for them if they're infected, but the chances of being infected are probably lower, maybe not massively lower, but a little bit. But this whole universe has been created by the vaccines, by universal vaccination. And we have driven the virus in a direction that it punishes the unvaccinated in this way. We have moved the risk around, but we haven't eliminated it. And you can't ever forget that. The correct policy was always to use the vaccines in a very limited way to vaccinate the highest risk people. And already then, if we had just done that, we would have reduced the overall population wide mortality risk to levels of seasonal influenza. We didn't have to vaccinate everyone, and we would reduce evolutionary pressure on the virus, and it would have been safer. And of course, we could observe how the virus had evolved in response to these interventions, and we could expand or restrict access to vaccines in the future. We didn't do that, and that was a huge mistake. And we are going to continue to see disadvantages from this mistake until we stop. People who don't want to be vaccinated are doing you a favor, and you have to leave them alone. They don't want it, and young people shouldn't be vaccinated. People who have already been sick, obviously, there's really no upside. universal vaccination campaigns need to stop. And they're dangerous, and they're going to make things a lot worse. So my response to Hanania is yes. If you don't want to end up in the hospital, if you're at risk, the vaccinations might be a good idea. But universal vaccination is a terrible idea. And moreover, your absolute risk as a relatively young man, I drink a lot, I don't smoke or anything, I run. There's no reason I don't need the vaccination. I'm completely safe and healthy, and it's also pro-social for me not to be vaccinated. It's better that I develop natural immunity, and there's no upside for the state to vaccinate me. They don't win anything, and it increases pressure on the virus and makes it worse. So that would be my response.
Mhm. And for example, if you said that only a fraction of the population should be vaccinated, do you think there would be a risk for even like a fraction of the population, let's say 5% of the population is still, a massive, hundreds of millions of people. Do you think that this effect of putting pressure on the virus, in the presence of a vaccine, would that not also influence the creation of new variants, or is it just proportionally lower risk to do that?
Yeah, the virus and its interactions with us is a complex system, and no one can control it, and no one can predict what will happen when you intervene in it. It's very complicated, and we still don't understand all the effects. I only present hypotheses about what's likely happening based on what we see with animals, but we still don't fully understand what's going on. It is obvious to me, anyway, that transmission is way up since vaccination, and there's a relationship. But that's all we can really say for sure. So you're intervening in a complex system, and you don't really know what consequences your interventions will have. So the smart thing to do from the start is to intervene as little as possible in demographic cohorts where there is the biggest possible upside. And if you look at how vaccines were developed in the past, polio vaccines against smallpox, of course, the most famous, is used first in very small groups of people locally, a few thousand, 10,000, 20,000. Then they sort of expand. They try to use it more and more, see what happens, see what kinds of side effects there are with the polio vaccine. There are serious missteps and mistakes. They adjust. They develop better methods, better vaccines. They vaccinate ever more widely over a course of 20, 30 years. And we have never done this before with a vaccine that was developed, in the course of a few months. Really, it was in the course of several days. In fact, in January, they had already the sequence, and it's the sequence for Spike, and we just immediately begin to vaccinate the entire population, and it's a very complex system. It will have very unpredictable effects, and we've seen that. And that was a huge mistake, according to me.
Yeah, it's just from the level of systemic risk. It's not something that anyone with an understanding of yeah, just the type of um risk that people are in, even if the downside is low, subjecting the whole world's population to a small risk of a catastrophic event is just not a feasible version of how to do things. So yeah, I completely agree with that. One thing that's been evident to me is that COVID and this whole crisis serves kind of a religious impulse in a lot of people. It's become a meaningful event to them, and I think you've also talked about Ludwig's thesis that this is kind of an equivalent to war for our generation. There's never been like a force majeure type event like this for decades at least. So I wonder what your perspective is like. What need does this fulfill? And is this part of why we're not going to get rid of COVID for a long time?
So the no one has ever been in my lifetime ever been called to national service or asked to engage in any sort of collective action on behalf of their nations or their countries or anything, and has been discouraged actually. And you're not supposed to think this way. And there's, I think, in all humans a desire to act on behalf of their society and their culture. And these opportunities have been systematically denied to us because they're inconvenient for the globalists and the supranational bureaucracies that sort of sit like pond scum on top of our political universe. And they are so obviously Corona and the response tapped into these instincts people have to sacrifice on behalf of their countries and even their villages or their cities, and most people that staying home, wearing masks, whatever else, keeping their kids socially isolated was pro-social and for the greater good. And so there's all of these bottled up instincts in all of us that they tapped into, and I won't deny it myself. Especially Germany, you're not allowed to be very nationalist or very interested in international military adventures. So initially, it seemed interesting that we would mobilize for this instead. So that's obviously a part of it. The other side is the state, of course, and I think there are always advantages for the state taking advantage of this instinct in the people, and the state has never been able to access it before. I think I said on Twitter, it's just my idea. Nuclear weapons prevent modern developed nation states from engaging in ordinary cycles of warfare and peace. So we're just locked in an internal peace cycle, and we all just get sicker and fatter, and everything gets worse because there's no broader national goals to trim off the fat and make us fitter and give us something to strive for. And so we are in this extended world of enforced peace, enforced by our own technology. The states still want to access the cultural nationalist sentiments of the people in some way, even if leftism makes it impossible or not very permissible to directly call up these sentiments. So Corona is another way in which they can ask people to act on behalf of the nation without being explicitly nationalist. It's been very interesting to see how in the Corona era, since April, maybe March, media has been very domestically focused for the first time. You don't read a lot on the front page about what's happening. I in fact asked you about Romania. You don't hear a lot about it. And certainly it's the first time where a lot of German media hasn't reported constantly on the United States, where the US is always in the media. You get often better informed about American elections and so forth, reading German papers than you are reading American ones. And for the last 18 months, you read almost nothing about the United States and German media. It's very interesting. It feels like a new sort of weird, perverted nationalism where instead we're always focused on our own country and is Corona up or down in Germany? What's going on? And so obviously there's a lot of these old forces that were excluded because the lack of prospect for military engagement. These old forces are still exist, and they've been appropriated and reused by the Corona response. And the question is, to what degree this was directed, to what degree people thought maybe we can access these instincts for disease suppression or activate them maybe for other purposes. I think there's no question climate change is another thing that they will now try to use a lot of these things for. It was just an accident. It was just the pressures were building up, and they could be then used. They just burst forth of themselves, and were part of the reason there was this massive preference cascade at the end of February, at the beginning of March, for lockdowns and for these sort of national actions against this disease. Or just the last point, I talked for a long time, but it's very interesting how there was never any population mobilization in response to Corona. So I and many others were infected already in March, and there was a huge problem about, how do we staff nursing homes so that we don't get the elderly sick. And many of us who had Corona very early. They could have drafted us to serve in nursing homes or to whatever, I don't know. And there was never any mobilization like that at all. There was never any attempt to call up people to act on behalf of the countries or low-risk youth to do food deliveries or anything like that. Would have been an obvious response for a SARS-like illness. And instead, the state just does nothing like that. And I think modern bureaucracies are afraid of mobilized citizenries and don't want to call people to mass action. It's dangerous. And throughout, therefore, there's this mobilizing tendency of Corona. There's a nationalist focus. Everyone's feeling German and feeling happy about their case numbers. They're down, and that's good for them. But they don't want people getting ideas. They don't want people joining organizations and meeting friends and delivering food to elderly people together. They might lose control of that kind of situation. I often said to myself, it would have been a lot more endurable, these lockdowns and everything, if we all had something to do. If we were all just, I remember this. Sorry, I will stop soon. But there's there's the whole thing with what do you call it? The spargel, the asparagus. They grow in the spring, and we always have, I guess, Eastern European migrant labor to harvest it. It's grown underground, and of course they couldn't come because of the lockdowns. And there's this half-hearted effort to recruit students to harvest the spargel, the asparagus, when it's like April or May or something, when it becomes ready to harvest. And many people on Facebook and on Twitter, many Germans I know, were all excited. It was fun. They went out with their school classmates, their friends, and they picked spargel. It's like we could have done that the whole time. We could have had things like this the whole time. Instead, students at university haven't been inside of a classroom or seen friends for 2 years. Imagine if you go to university, it's your first year, 2020. You have hardly been to a library. You've been in school for 2 years. It's crazy to me. And they live in these Wohngemeinschaften, these little awful apartments, and with 25 other students or whatever, and they're all by themselves. And it's this profoundly depressing, awful situation, and they never mobilized the population. They never did anything like that. There's many obvious things they could have.
Yeah. It's I really like your point about this kind of new flavor of nationalism that's been kind of okayed, but it's not really nationalism. It's kind of like a liberal, I don't know, bastardization of a nationalistic impulse, and it's only been filtered through the approved channels of kind of like this feminization of I don't know, this safetyist culture of this denial of death. The ultimate kind of womb environment where you never suffer any consequences, and if we all work together, no one will die again. And it's irrational and histrionic and very weird. But because it's you can't really protect people in India by not wearing a mask, and you just protect the people around you. Those instincts of protecting your neighbor have kind of been taken over to be funneled into essentially, I don't know, an acceleration of forces that were already at work, of essentially this kind of totalizing, devouring mother that's been piped in hot through every channel for decades now. I don't know. I think it's a very good point. Yeah, it's a depressing reality.
Yeah, there's I don't know what to say really about it. It's another one of these things that it seems like it's evolved into a quasi stable system, right? And it's not really turning it off or redirecting it or anything. It's just sort of stagnating in this position. And I don't know. I've been very pessimistic about the ability at the social level to turn this off. I think that governments will eventually try to withdraw the policy. I think it's already happening. They're trying to withdraw the policies, or at least moderate them, make them sort of longer term sustainable. At least in Germany, I sense there's an effort to make to find some sort of some kind of permanent containment, stabilized containment regime that they can maintain indefinitely, which is much milder and doesn't depend on a lot of the arbitrary interventions in the economy and so forth. But it's opposed all the time by these very quasi-stable social systems that they've unwittingly or maybe wittingly set up, that people have achieved a lot of private consensus among themselves about what kind of containment is necessary and what kinds of actions are necessary in response to the disease, and they're not going to stop. A lot of ordinary people will be doing this until I die. It's very obvious.
Yeah. Do you think they still believe that COVID zero is the aim? Do you think that they can banish the great dragon, or what's the animating impulse there?
It's very interesting. All of the COVID zero people, those these people, they're gone. You hardly hear from them anymore. They are a small clique of actually a lot of physicists, which is interesting, and modelers and so forth. They are now out of favor, and they are already worried about this. They have their own zero COVID conferences and so forth, and one can listen to their talks. They're already worried about this in the spring of this year, that they had locked themselves into the opposite of the COVID denialist position, that they had become the extreme on the other side of people who say there is no virus or something, and so they've mostly been banished from public discourse. I think that there is no more official hope entertained that the virus can be eradicated. I don't know though what people think that they're doing. For example, wearing masks. So what? What are you doing? Everyone is going to get the virus, whether you're vaccinated or not, whether you wear masks or not. We all have had multiple infections of the other common human coronaviruses. Every last person on Earth has had the other 4 human coronaviruses at least once, multiple times, most of the cases. And there's no way you're not going to get this. So why are you doing this? And it's very bizarre to me, and how little this is discussed or contemplated by often quite intelligent people. I have colleagues who behave, who are, PhDs, professors, people, even in the media, who behave about this in ways that just strike me as completely ridiculous. If you're going to get it, there's no reason to delay, because you're going to get older, and your risk will go up. The only thing you can do is get sick now and get over it. And I think also because we drive virulent strains with our vaccinations, you don't have to wait too long to get sick. So I don't know what people think. I think one thing that's happened is the media the press has relentlessly exaggerated the risk of corona for propaganda purposes. This is deliberate. There are even internal documents from the German Interior Ministry that talk about this. It was a public health measure, part of the public health measures, to exaggerate the risk of corona so people would stay home and so forth. And this created this kind of feedback mechanism where a lot of the media then responds to their own panic propaganda with more insaneness, and again, everyone's at home, no one's grounded in reality or has any direct experience of the disease, and so this has created this sort of storm of self-reinforcing disease paranoia, and people, if you believe the things that you read in the paper about how dangerous corona is, you can't go outside. The people believe this has a 10% fatality rate. They believe that it will kill their children. And so we have all these social crutches that allow people to go outside and feel okay about it. And so the masks are one of those things, right? And vaccines are a huge one of those things. People are being vaccinated and demanding others be vaccinated because they're just terrified. And no one's thinking about this clearly. No one's understanding that they're all going to get it. Yeah, I don't know. I'm rambling. There's not much to say. It's a very very broken situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just makes me think about, the power of anecdote, because this is kind of the thing that's been I feel animating a lot of like social hysteria lately. I mean, if you even look at, the George Floyd incident, it is complete worldwide total hysteria based on a recorded video anecdote. And I feel like coronavirus started this way as well. You'd see people collapsing in Wuhan, and the people in the hazmat suits collecting, I don't know, corpses off the street, or just this crazy, I don't know, very strange, overblown anecdotes. And then you also have all of these little anecdotes, because now this is how, for example, here in Romania, how they're driving vaccine uptake is complete hysteria in the media. Like my mother was like a few days ago, she was like, "Babies are dying. Your baby will die." And I was like, I don't think so. I don't think the coronavirus changed so suddenly overnight that babies are dying, and my baby specifically, my baby will die. So, yeah, it's and they're pushing this thing that a 40-year-old man regrets not taking the vaccine on his deathbed, and he died, I don't know, exploding from coronavirus or something like that. And yeah, it's the fact that these little fragments of information can have this outside effect to freeze the planet in place for 2 years tells you also that a lot of this, I think, is also technologically mediated. Like you wouldn't have had the possibility to have this just histrionic reaction to it if you didn't have the side of the media not only promoting this stuff but actually profiting off of presenting things this way, because this is the ultimate clickbait. Everyone's seen the George Floyd video, everyone's seen the Wuhan collapses and all of that. So I don't know, it's do you think that this is we're stuck in the situation also because we have this technology that we're also addicted to as well?
There's no question. They social technology, social media was integral to lockdowns, promoting them in the earliest stages and promoting compliance with them. It's very obvious, and it was also used by whoever was behind this. So you mentioned the videos, which are super interesting. There were coordinated social media campaigns to encourage compliance with measures, and also in the earliest days, in early March, to encourage citizens of governments with governments, for example, the United Kingdom, which were not interested in locking down initially. Also in Germany, this was the case, though it's often been overlooked. Initially, Angela Merkel, she said we would 70% of the populace would be infected, and basically gestured in the direction of sort of the Swedish approach. There were social media campaigns to get citizens of these countries that were more relaxed about it to contact their politicians and to be outraged about the approach. So there was a massive use of social media, very sophisticated, very very high level stuff. I wrote about it in German. This it's very interesting, and we still don't know who did this. It's very curious. Some of the accounts is Michael Sanger has pointed out or managed out of China, but by no means all of them. And there are still some of these accounts still operate. It's very interesting, and it's you think there would be massive interest in who is promoting lockdowns via Twitter. So there's clearly a social media element, and it was used to manipulate people and to disseminate sort of panic propaganda independently of national governments, often against their interests and against their prior policies. And this was done in the UK, and it was done in Germany, and it was done in Italy also. It's a very interesting thing. Of course, I think this would never have happened without internet technology. For one, the home office thing would be even more of an obvious farce than it already is. We're all in home office, and I'm supposed to be working right now. Actually, it's a joke. No one does anything anymore, and but without the internet, you could not even pretend to work. That would never have happened, of course, and there are multiple directions in which this. It seems that the internet has encouraged this, and social media, in particular. It's also. I just as a final point. It's if you consider you mentioned these anecdotes. Of course, you can always, with millions of infections, you can always find a 40-year-old man who's dying or something. It's always going to be outliers like this. But it's very interesting how this was never done with influenza. So influenza also kills a not insignificant number of young people, of children, of professional age men like myself, and we never think about it. I had influenza many times in my life, and never mattered, and it's super. And of course, and I remember you'd even have you wouldn't even make a special effort to isolate yourself or to avoid infecting others. You're sick, you try to manage it and get through. And it's super interesting how there was also then a deliberate decision to keep these grim anecdotes out of the media and out of sight. There was a deliberate strategy about influenza that developed after 1918 when seasonal flu became a regular thing for human society. A strategy that developed that we would allow infections to happen. And along with that strategy was ignoring that influenza was dangerous and that influenza kills a lot of people. And so we had the opposite approach. And it's very interesting just to look back on stories about bad influenza waves. So I don't know about Romania, but here in Germany, 2017 to 18 was very bad. We had almost mortality that winter. It was a very bad flu. It was sort of a new reassorted strain, killed a lot of people, and it was just hardly ever reported. No one was interested in the anecdotes about children dying, though many children did die, and it was all kept out of the news. And this was also a deliberate strategy.
That's really interesting. Yeah. And, do you think it's yeah? I mean, you say it's deliberate, but it's I feel like it's been kind of a recent thing where people just glom onto anecdotes and blow them up. It feels like we haven't really had this, and like we said, like 2017 it wasn't really as bad as it is now, like where something happens and that turns into a world event. I don't know, it's for me it's always hard to ascribe coordination to these things, but yeah, I mean, these are like significant death numbers, and influenza also does attack younger cohorts as well. So yeah, it is pretty striking, like the difference between how that's interpreted and coronavirus is interpreted. A lot of people say that it's the boomers' last gasp because they're all being attacked by this very specific boomer targeted virus, and that's why the whole world convulses. But yeah, I don't know what to make of that. But yeah, it is very strange that there's this difference.
I think there's some. Of course, I don't think the press gathers together in secret international meetings to coordinate coverage internationally. I think there is, however, more I've learned. I think, especially observing corona coverage, there's more coordination in press coverage than I presumed, or that I had assumed before. And maybe that's mostly Germany, where a lot of Germans don't know, but our media here is very dominated by state media organizations. So there are television and also subventions to many newspapers and so forth. It's all funded by the government. So we have very large state media coverage in Germany, and it's the most influential, and that's very, very coordinated, actually. So there's your news is not as independent from political happenings or from policies and so forth as it is in many other countries. So there is a lot of coordination in German media, but I've been also convinced by the last year that there is more coordination than you would think, even internationally and with international media, and that if there are conspiracies anywhere, it's at the level of messaging and media operations, which are often very interesting, how they're all coordinated and they're always on the same note within 24 hours. I really do think there was a deliberate strategy with influenza to try to play down the negative consequences, because it had been proven there was no there was no way to mitigate influenza. The vaccines against influenza don't work really. It's a sort of dirty secret of flu vaccines. They're a total failure. They're better than perhaps corona vaccines. They don't work so much that they don't even subject influenza to evolutionary pressure. They're completely worthless. So it's much better. But there was, I think, initially in the 20s and 30s, a consensus developed that you had to let especially children get sick with influenza, and that would, even though some children die, you had to allow this to happen. That was the only kind of way to mitigate broader mortality, so that as you get older, you have this lingering immunity to these flu strains. And so there's always this we try to let people get flu, and that's a big part of why the media looks the other way all the time, even though many countries post serious flu influenza fatalities in the winter. Yeah, that's all I would say.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's just shocking to see that there's absolutely no rationality between like behind all of this. There's always the veil of where the Homo economicus and people are acting on rational bases, but yeah, this just doesn't make any sense. I mean, just the outside reaction is crazy. But before I let you go, I want to ask you two more questions. I want to ask you: is there any kind of white pill in your discoveries? Is there anything that makes you hopeful? Any sort of piece of data or information that you think might be interesting? Because this is a very black pilling episode, obviously. It seems like we're on rails towards a dark future. But is there anything that makes you think, this might be a hopeful direction?
I don't need to black pill. I'm always accused of over white pilling on my Twitter account. I think the biggest white pill for me in the last 2 or 3 months is the degree to which it's very obvious that leadership in not only Germany but in much of Europe has repudiated lockdown strategies against corona. The modelers have totally disappeared. I'm not saying we won't lock down again, Alex. I believe you're right that they won't ever be able to put this policy away. But the elites understood what we also understood, that these are terrible policies and they want to do everything to avoid them. And a big part of their vaccination insanity is they just don't want to have to lock down again. And these are people who have limited information about what's happening, and they're desperate to survive this politically, and they are hoping that by forcing high levels of vaccination, they can achieve better outcomes and won't have to lock down again. And the most white pilling thing for me is the degree to which this whole strategy implies that the political elite especially despises the modelers, scientific advisors, everyone, the virologists, these odious virologists, all these losers, that they're massively hated, not only by us, but also by bureaucrats and people in power. The health establishment is in the middle of burning itself down. And I really believe that going forward, things are dark, but there's growing desire on the parts of many different parts of our bureaucracies and our political leadership to free themselves from these absolute losers and try to develop more rational policies. And again, a lot of these people are really stupid, and it's going to take them a long time to find a way out. But there's at least many clues and suggestions that they are totally repudiating these policies. And of course, that's not enough. It doesn't mean that lockdowns end. There's a lot of media pressure. There's a lot of popular pressure in favor of them. There's a lot of momentum and inertia that has to be shut down. But in the meantime, this understanding that these were huge errors and that they have to be avoided in the future is growing. And I think that's very clear. And I think also we can hope the same thing will happen for the vaccines. In the future, I think a lot of these mandates will be repudiated and will be increasingly avoided because they're not working. And so one of the things I always talk about is how containment is very counterproductive for especially elected politicians. So I'm very anti-democratic, but it's convenient that we're stuck with containment in democratic countries because with media hysteria, you develop a huge organic demand, grassroots demand for containment. And politicians like our odious Markus Söder, the governor of Bavaria, play to this as populists, taking a hard line on containment. And for a time, they can become popular by locking down and by making everyone wear 12 masks and vaccinate or whatever, but they can't ever kill corona. And that's all the constituency wants. So they end up in these really awkward positions where they're courting a constituency that hates them because they haven't killed the disease. And if you go and look at Söder, if you look at his comment section on Twitter, every post this loser makes, there's thousands of people who are these vaccination corona hysterics, 50-year-old German women who live in Oberbayern who are so mad that he hasn't killed it yet, and they're even madder at him than I am, and it's a losing position, and at the end of the day, we're going to win just because of that, because the containment policies, you can't ever contain the virus, and they're not going to win. And the best thing to do is to draw attention away from it and to wind it down. And that's the only way to succeed as a politician in Western democracies with corona. It's just going to take them a long time to do this.
Yeah, to roll it back. But just looking at how fast the narrative can change, there's a lot of hope in that, because we've had quite huge shifts in the narrative, be they top down or bottom up or emergent or whichever way, but the narrative shifted a lot. So yeah, that sounds pretty hopeful. I hope that lockdowns will be winding down because yeah, they're still very much on the table here, and they're I think we have a curfew now. To be honest, I have been ignoring coronavirus restrictions, except for I wear a mask in the store because I don't want to, create problems for the people in the store. But yeah, I'm not wearing them on the street, though they're mandatory, and I'm not following curfew because it's nuts, and I don't even know how they're going to enforce that. But anyway, moving on to the last question, which is a question of the show, which I ask everyone. Is there a subversive thinker, writer, someone who's been influential on your thinking that you think that people should read more of or look into?
Of course, there are many thinkers I could recommend, but on this podcast, I would recommend my friend Martin Lichtmesch, because he writes for the Operation Schnellroder, Sezession im Netz, der German dissident, right-wing maybe, nationalist operation, but he's an Austrian, and I've read him for years, and since I've gained some attention on Twitter, we've become friends, and I would recommend maybe you interview him at some point. He's fine to interview in English. His English very good, and he'll be interesting. He's sort of one of the most interesting thinkers in the German or the European even new right. So the Nouvelle Droite also is the sort of French post-war attempts to reimagine what the kind of post-war, post-fascism kind of right-wing would look like in Europe. And for me, Lichtmesch is very interesting. So I would recommend him.
Okay, so this is Martin Rader or?
Lichtmesch is his name.
Okay.
L-I-C, like Licht, like light. E-M. Speaking German or English. The M-E-S.
Okay.
Said. Yeah.
Okay. That's good. I don't know what I heard before, but yeah. Sorry.
I know the distortion is terrible. I can't hear how I'm sounding, so it's very, very bizarre for me. I'm sorry.
No worries. It's the distortion's always a little bit of a tricky thing. It's it varies a little bit. We'll try to patch it up. I think you're pretty much we can understand 99% of what you said. So I think that's good enough for Pyro.
Sorry.
No worries. It happens. I mean, I think all of our chats recently that have been with distortion, there's always a little bit of leakage. It's just not a perfect system. I've got this soundboard now where I could apparently distort people live, but one, I don't know how to use it, and two, people would have to trust me with their voice docs quite a bit hard. So I don't know if that's going to happen anytime soon. But yeah, for the time being, we're gonna ride with this with these voice mods because I think it's definitely useful and yeah, awesome to be able to chat to people who typically don't necessarily have a voice. Though you now have a voice, actually, and that leads me to your podcast and your Substack. Tell me a bit about that.
So I didn't really have great plans for either. It's sort of hard to describe. You develop internet personas, and this is of course a long line. I've had many accounts before, and you're banned or whatever, and you try again. And so it's the Eugyppius account, and I don't know. I was very shy about speaking and having my voice heard, but I also understood after Bronze Age Pervert was banned that you want to expand your reach across different media and platforms because it's going to happen to me soon, and I don't doubt I'll be banned from Twitter maybe next month or next year. As I get more followers, it's more dangerous, and so it will happen. So I wanted to experiment with audio and also blogging, which is how I started under different identities as well. So I never had any reach like I have now. No one cared about what I wrote before. But I had originally this idea I would have a Substack and I'd write about matters that are of interest to me professionally. But I can't do that anymore because I have the readership and people know who I am if I write about the historical topics I'm interested in. So I can't do that, so it has to be, I guess, about Corona and so forth. Maybe a sort of side interest of mine, where few will recognize me, is witchcraft and understandings of magic in the later Middle Ages and early modern period. It's sort of a hobby of mine. It's not my official field, and I've never published there, so I think it's safe if I write about it. So maybe I'll have some Substack essays on these topics as well. And as for the audio, yeah, I tried it. A lot of people don't like this distortion. It's very brave of you to host me. I'm not sure how often I do it because it irritates me when people complain about the way it sounds. The truth is I can't appear undisguised on the internet with my voice because there are a lot of videos of me speaking at lectures and so forth where I can be recognized and it'd be trivial to identify me. And so it's a little bit dangerous, but I think the distortion, I've shopped it around to some friends and not said it was me and asked them, who do you think this is? And they didn't recognize it, so I think it's safe. So I'm sorry about that. But I think with the podcast, maybe I do it once a month. It's very hard for me. It's a lot of energy to speak like this under my pseudonym, which I'm not used to doing. And so I think maybe once a month, and I'll try to. I don't know. I would like the podcast ideally to be about something that isn't Corona. I want to not talk about this so much. To be honest, I sort of hate it. I hate the virus, and I want it to go away. And it's not something that is inherently interesting to me. The interesting things are deceptions surrounding it and so forth. But the virus itself is not very interesting. And so I would like to develop if I have a leadership to cultivate a leadership that is not just interested in this thing, that would be interested in my thoughts on other matters too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully the virus is not going to be, the main theme of our lives forever, so that you can, calmly leave behind this theme, because you have a lot of very interesting stuff to say about it. I'm very happy that you are interested in it and on all the research you've done on the topic. But man, this is the one thing I really want to leave behind. We've had enough of this. Yeah, but I want to thank you for coming on. I want people to follow you on Twitter. It's, I think, a Eugyppius one. I'll put the link in the show notes, and also sign up for your Substack, which is, I think, Eugyppius at .substack.com.
Yes, that's all correct. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a great honor to appear on your podcast, Alex.
Oh, I'm very happy you came on. Yeah, well, I'll see you on the interwebs.
Yes. See you soon.